In 1974, in a small town in the county of Kent, southeast England, a 10-year-old boy began to disrupt the family routine with claims that deviated from any known experience. His name was Paul Whitmore, an applied student at a local primary school with no relevant medical history. After a mild fever, his mother reported that he woke up with a start, speaking German, a language absent from the family's daily life. In the following days, the speech became recurrent. Paul claimed to have another name and belonged to another house. He insisted that his name was Friedrich and described scenes strange to his life in Kent: a wide river nearby, a stone bridge, and a red roof next to the tracks of a train that passed almost right next to it. In the beginning, his parents attributed the episodes to dreams, childish imagination, or echoes from the television. The hypothesis lost strength when the descriptions gained detail and consistency. Paul mentioned sirens cutting through the night, men in blue-gray uniforms, and a persistent smell of iron and smoke. In a neutral tone, he said he had died when the siren started and called his previous mother Greta. The temporal suggestions pointed to the Second World War. The family sought the general practitioner, who ruled out apparent neurological causes. With no cultural references to Germany, the Whitmores were left without a plausible explanation. It was then that, upon reading an article in a British periodical about children who claimed to remember previous lives, they discovered the work coordinated at the University of Virginia by psychiatrist Ian Stevenson, known for systematic studies of this type of report. Since there was no proven prior exposure of Paul to the German language or culture, the case was considered relevant for a formal investigation. In July 1975, Ian Stevenson and psychologist Emily Cook traveled to England to begin documentation. The procedure followed the pattern of previous research: separate interviews with the parents, teachers, and the boy, audio recordings, and a meticulous record of every potentially verifiable statement. Paul maintained a remarkably stable account throughout the sessions. He said he had lived near Mannheim and referred to a train shed hit by bombs during the night. He neither dramatized nor seemed anxious. He narrated like someone recalling ordinary facts. At various moments, he spontaneously reproduced isolated words in standard German with a childlike but correct intonation. No relative was proficient in the language. The father worked in railway maintenance, and the mother taught arts, both British of English origin. In his field notes, Stevenson recorded that the absence of cultural reinforcement and the level of detail suggest unique material. The team decided to move on to the comparative stage, to check in historical archives for coincidences between the elements provided by the boy and the reality of German cities during the war period. The mentions of a large river, a stone bridge, and railway installations indicated an urban industrial axis compatible with Mannheim in the 1940s. Upon returning to Charlottesville, Stevenson brought about 10 hours of tapes and more than 40 pages of notes. Every phrase from Paul was transcribed and classified into categories: proper names, places, occupations, and circumstances of the alleged death, to, in the researcher's words, assess the degree of factual correspondence before any external contact. The plan foresaw, if the data remained consistent, a survey in German territory. Until then, the central question guiding Stevenson's work remained: what, in objective terms, could or could not be explained by indirect learning, fantasy, or statistical coincidence? In the autumn of 1975, Ian Stevenson obtained authorization from Paul's parents to continue the investigation in German territory. The goal was simple in concept, but complex in execution: to determine if the boy's descriptions corresponded to real historical locations and records. The city of Mannheim, repeatedly mentioned in the sessions, was chosen as the starting point. In November of that year, Stevenson traveled to Germany accompanied by a local interpreter, bringing his original notes and transcribed excerpts of the boy's statements. The city still bore visible marks of the destruction caused by the Second World War bombings. Stevenson toured the area around the Neckar River, the rebuilt bridges, and the restored railway yards. He noted that the topography and track layout coincided with Paul's descriptions. a wide watercourse, a stone bridge connecting the banks, and the presence of old maintenance sheds near the main lines. The visual correspondence was noted, but the researcher knew that confirmation required more than subjective impressions. In the municipal archives, Stevenson found the record of a railway worker named Friedrich Meyer, who died in 1944 during an air raid. The indicated address was less than a kilometre from the area described by Paul in Kent. According to the document, Meyer was 28 years old and worked in locomotive maintenance, a direct coincidence with the occupations mentioned by the boy. Even so, the psychiatrist avoided premature conclusions. He only noted significant coincidence, but insufficient for identity inference. Back in England, Stevenson administered a visual recognition test. He showed the boy a series of recent photographs of German cities without indicating their names. Among images of Mainz, Heidelberg, and Mannheim, Paul immediately pointed to a bridge and said, "This is the river." Upon seeing an old railway depot, he reacted spontaneously. "I used to work here. It was dark and noisy." The reaction was filmed, and Stevenson observed that the tone of voice conveyed neither fantasy nor dramatization, but something close to factual recognition. For control, other photographs with similar landscapes were presented, without any sign of familiarity from the boy. In his preliminary report, Stevenson listed 5 elements considered verifiable: the spontaneous speech in German, the consistent description of a specific location, the recognition of real structures, the absence of prior cultural exposure, and the documented existence of a person compatible with the described profile. Based on this data, the case was classified as open for confirmation. The next step would be to identify surviving relatives of Friedrich Meyer and, if possible, to confront their memories with the information provided by Paul. Stevenson believed that only the convergence between independent accounts could reduce the margin of error. Thus, between January and April 1976, he initiated correspondence with local agencies and the German Red Cross office. The case, initially treated with skepticism, began to attract academic attention. For Stevenson, however, the real challenge was not in proving reincarnation, but in testing how far human memory could go beyond the known boundaries between experience, identity, and time. In May 1976, after months of exchanging correspondence with local authorities, Ian Stevenson received a letter from Heidelberg. The sender was Helga Meyer, who claimed to be the sister of Friedrich, the railway worker who died in 1944. She agreed to give a statement, provided her identity remained confidential and the research was conducted with discretion. Stevenson traveled again to Germany, accompanied by his assistant Emily Cook, bringing with him only a summary of Paul's statements, without revealing specific details, to avoid any involuntary influence. The meeting took place in the simple living room of Helga's apartment, in a post-war building on the outskirts of Heidelberg. The interview followed the standard ethical protocol adopted by the University of Virginia. The interviewee spoke freely before knowing any information provided by the child. Helga reported that her brother had worked in locomotive maintenance at the Mannheim railway yard and that he had lost his life during a nighttime bombing while helping younger colleagues find shelter. She described him as calm, methodical, a man of few words, and with a curious habit. He always carried a small metal whistle used to signal the start of train maneuvers. Back in England, Stevenson organized a new session with Paul. Among the photographs and objects presented, a series of whistles, lanterns, and tools typical of railway work was included. Upon seeing the metal whistle, the boy reacted instantly. "It was like this. That was my sound." He showed no interest in the other instruments, merely observing the object for a few seconds in silence. The parents reported that in the following weeks, their son began to draw trains, bridges, and uniformed male figures with increasing precision. In all the sketches, there was a siren in the background and a point of light in the sky, like a distant memory. When questioned, Paul replied, "It's me," before. The tone was neutral, without fear or pride, just a statement of fact. Stevenson recorded that the boy seemed to maintain a serene relationship with his own memories, without signs of anxiety or emotional distress. In one of his reports, he wrote, "The absence of fear in the face of the memory of death indicates that the content is treated as fact, not as trauma." The study advanced methodically. In parallel, the University of Virginia team submitted Paul's audio recordings to the analysis of specialized linguists. The result indicated that the accent of the German words pronounced by the boy corresponded to the Baden-Württemberg dialect, precisely the Mannheim region. As time went on, the manifestations began to weaken. Paul's teacher observed an improvement in concentration and a decrease in mentions of the other name. Stevenson interpreted the phenomenon as part of a recurrent pattern. As the child grew, the memories became vaguer, like echoes dissipating with the maturation of the new identity. Before the forgetting was complete, Stevenson decided to carry out one final experimental stage, a controlled return to Germany. His objective was to observe whether Paul would spontaneously recognize locations linked to the alleged past, without any hint or induction. The experiment would be conducted with scientific rigor, under continuous observation and limited duration. After careful discussions with the parents and favorable ethical opinions, the plan was confirmed. In the summer of 1976, Ian Stevenson organized an experimental trip with Paul and his family, following a strict control protocol. The route would be unknown to the boy, and no information about the final destination would be mentioned before arrival. The purpose was to observe spontaneous reactions, whether there would be signs of genuine recognition or responses based on suggestion. Stevenson and his assistant Emily Cook traveled a day earlier, coordinating with local authorities in Mannheim the access to the places that would be visited. The City Hall authorized filming and observations around the old railway yard, partially rebuilt after the war. The remaining ruins, brick walls, sections of tracks, and an old water reservoir had been preserved as historical industrial structures. The following morning, the Whitmores boarded a train in Frankfurt. Paul, sitting by the window, observed the landscape with a neutral expression. Stevenson noted in his diary, "Contained expression without anxiety." Attention focused on external stimuli, reactions similar to anticipated recollection. Shortly before arriving in Mannheim, the boy murmured softly, "The river is close." The phrase was recorded in audio and later transcribed as evidence of spontaneous association. Upon disembarking, the group walked through central areas of the city. Stevenson deliberately avoided any mention of street names or monuments. At one point, upon approaching a stone bridge over the Neckar River, Paul stopped abruptly and commented, "I know that sound." He was referring to the metallic echo of the train wheels passing in the distance. Next, the researcher led him to the old railway workshops. The boy looked around and without hesitation pointed, "The tools used to be there, and the water tank was bigger." The most striking observation occurred in front of a partially rebuilt wall. Paul remained silent for a few seconds and then calmly said, "It ended here, when the sky turned red." Stevenson precisely recorded the episode, observing that the predominant emotion seemed to be melancholy, not fear. As a psychological precaution, the visit lasted less than half an hour. No new data was suggested, and the boy received no additional information about Friedrich Meyer. Upon returning to the hotel, he behaved quietly and began to draw the same scenery again, now with more details and exact proportions. In his subsequent report, Stevenson stated that the trip added an additional degree of empirical confirmation, as Paul's responses occurred in a controlled environment, without external clues. He concluded that the probability of imaginative reconstruction based on visual coincidence is unlikely, given the level of specificity observed. In the following months, the case became part of a set of comparative studies on spontaneous memories in European children. Stevenson's methodology and ethical restraint received praise even from skeptical critics. For the researcher himself, that journey was not aimed at proving anything supernatural, but at recording with scientific discipline how certain memories emerge beyond the usual limits of known memory. In early 1977, Ian Stevenson began the final phase of analysis of the case catalogued under the code EU 47 Man. Back at the University of Virginia, he systematized the field observations, interviews, recordings, and historical records obtained in Mannheim. The objective was to compare every detail of Paul's statements with verifiable data and assess whether the coincidences could be explained by conventional means, such as indirect learning, statistical coincidence, or childhood imagination. The preliminary report summarized 37 specific claims attributed to the boy. Of these, 24 showed correspondence with documented facts: the presence of a stone bridge over the river, the metallic noise of the trains, the smell of smoke and oil, the blue-gray uniform of the railway workers, and the use of a small metal whistle. Period photographs and local testimonies confirmed these elements. To test alternative hypotheses, Stevenson conducted 3 lines of analysis. The first dealt with cryptomnesia, unconscious memories of information inadvertently obtained. The family was extensively questioned. There were no books in German, no war movies were watched, and no prior contact with native speakers had occurred. Paul's German vocabulary had emerged spontaneously, without formal teaching. The second hypothesis considered statistical coincidence. Stevenson compared the number of Paul's factual hits with samples of reports from other children who made up stories, observing that the degree of accuracy far exceeded what would be expected by chance. The third line of investigation involved independent psychological evaluations. Consulting psychiatrists examined the case and concluded that the boy demonstrated healthy imagination with no signs of delusion, dissociation, or psychosis. In his personal notes, Stevenson wrote, "The value of this case is not in proving reincarnation, but in challenging the restricted model of human memory. Some recollections seem to arise outside the known paths of learning and experience." The study gained moderate attention among his peers, especially because it was a European case where the cultural context did not reinforce beliefs in reincarnation. The German psychologist Hans Bender, then director of the Freiburg Institute of Psychology, praised the methodology, although he remained skeptical about the spiritual implications. Meanwhile, Paul's life followed its natural course. As the years passed, the memories diminished until they almost disappeared. When asked about Friedrich, he merely said, "It was a dream that felt real." Stevenson ended the active follow-up in 1977, registering the case as closed. Years later, the case EU-47 man would become a constant reference in the researchers' conferences. For him, the episode of Paul Whitmore represented a rare type of phenomenon, a vivid, coherent, and documented memory arising in an environment without a cultural predisposition to accept it. Stevenson's conclusion remained prudent. What he had observed, he said, was not proof of a doctrine, but an invitation to reconsider the limits of consciousness and identity. For a scientist accustomed to objectivity, every phrase from Paul sounded less like a mystical mystery and more like an empirical datum that science did not yet know how to interpret. In the years following the official closing of the investigation, Paul Whitmore resumed his school routine in Kent. As he grew, the memories that once haunted him diluted into increasingly faint fragments. By the age of 15, he no longer spoke spontaneously about Friedrich, although he maintained a constant interest in trains, bridges, and machinery. His father observed, with some irony, that his son seemed to be returning to the same occupation, only this time consciously. In 1980, Ian Stevenson decided to re-examine the case as part of a broader study on the persistence of identity in childhood memories. He sent letters to the Whitmores requesting updates. The mother responded, reporting that Paul, now a teenager, kept the old notes and some drawings made at the age of 10 in a box. She mentioned a curious episode. While watching a report about the reconstruction of Mannheim, Paul commented casually that the sound of the trains is different now. He could not explain why. For Stevenson, that type of comment represented what he called mnemonic residue, a residual memory without emotional charge that survives conscious forgetting. According to his comparative observations, it was common for children with memories of previous lives to progressively lose the affective link with the past as they consolidated their present identity. In 1983, Stevenson published an analysis comparing 7 European cases of alleged previous life recollections. Paul Whitmore's stood out for the clarity of the descriptions and the relatively short duration of the phenomenon. In all cases, the same pattern was noted: memories that emerged between the ages of 3 and 10 and dissipated before adolescence. The researcher wrote, "These memories seem to act as fragments of an interrupted narrative, which is exhausted when the new self achieves stability." Linguistic studies conducted by the Freiburg Institute at Stevenson's request confirmed that the German accent of the words spoken by Paul was compatible with the Mannheim dialect. For the linguists, this coincidence remained statistically improbable without prior exposure. Even so, the scientific community maintained a cautious position, recognizing the rigor of the method, but avoiding any metaphysical conclusions. Stevenson himself insisted on a descriptive posture. In lectures, he repeated that his role was to record the phenomenon with the same discipline that would be applied to any observable event. The conviction that the scientist should only document and not convert had become one of his hallmarks. Meanwhile, Paul advanced in life discreetly. He studied mechanical engineering and, at the age of 20, began working for a local railway company. When a reporter sought him out for an interview, he politely refused, saying only, "It was something I knew, then I stopped knowing." For Stevenson, this simplicity illustrated the natural outcome of the case: a memory that had completed its cycle, leaving only traces, the distant sound of a train and the recollection of a German name that for some reason an English boy once called his own. During the 1990s, already recognized as a pioneer in the study of spontaneous previous life memories, Ian Stevenson began to review his decades of research with the aim of consolidating the most consistent cases. Among the more than 2,000 episodes investigated in 38 countries, only 31 had occurred in Western Europe, and among these, the case of Paul Whitmore remained one of the most complete and methodologically sound. In the 1995 revision notes, Stevenson acknowledged that the phenomenon remained unexplained in light of available psychological and neurological knowledge. He reread Paul's field notes, recordings, and photographs in Mannheim with the same caution with which he always conducted his studies. He observed the absence of secondary gains, the lack of cultural encouragement, and the internal consistency of the statements. He wrote, "Nothing in this case indicates fraud, deliberate fantasy, or a search for notoriety. We are left to consider that there is something in human memory that we still do not fully understand." At that time, the theme of reincarnation remained marginal in Western academia, but Stevenson's methodology, focused on cross-interviews, documentary verification, and control of cultural variables, began to be cited as a model for qualitative investigations of anomalous phenomena. In German universities, small teams of psychologists and linguists began discussing the European cases from a phenomenological perspective, not with the aim of proving reincarnation, but of understanding how certain memory contents could emerge outside the known channels of learning. In correspondence with the Icelandic psychologist Erlendur Haraldsson, a research partner in other countries, Stevenson briefly mentioned the boy from Kent. The Western cases, due to their rarity, may teach us that memory does not belong only to the brain, but passes through it, as if the body were only one of its possible supports. Meanwhile, Paul, now an adult, lived reservedly in a coastal town in southern England. He worked in locomotive maintenance and demonstrated a curious natural affinity for the job, without formal training in the railway area. When, in 1998, German journalists sought him out for a documentary on reincarnation, he refused the invitation. He responded by letter to a researcher in Freiburg with few words: "If there was a Friedrich, I wish him peace. I am moving on." Stevenson cited this response years later at a conference at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California, presenting it as an example of spontaneous reconciliation between past and present. "Not everyone who remembers seeks to prove something," he commented. "Some just acknowledge the mystery and let it go." When he published Reincarnation and Biology in 1997, Stevenson included Paul Whitmore in a methodological section on non-traumatic memories in a European context. The case stood out for not presenting physical marks associated with the previous life, only precise verbal and visual memories. For the researcher, this made the phenomenon even more intriguing. A memory without a body, but with form, time, and geography. By this time, his health was beginning to decline, but his conviction remained firm. The study of consciousness required the same rigor and humility applied to the exact sciences. Stevenson said that the function of science is not to defend beliefs, but to record the inexplicable with honesty. When Ian Stevenson passed away in 2007, at the age of 88, the case of Paul Whitmore, the English boy who spoke German and remembered another name, remained carefully filed in the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. On the shelves of the institution rested his original notes, audio tapes, and black and white photographs of Mannheim, labeled with the code EU47 Mann. The dossier was intact, preserved with the same meticulousness that had characterized the researcher's work for half a century. In the years that followed, new scholars resumed the material. The physician and researcher Emily Kelly, a close collaborator of Stevenson, published a re-evaluation of the most relevant European cases in 2013. In the section dedicated to Paul, she highlighted factual accuracy without plausible cultural explanation, concluding that, regardless of the spiritual hypothesis, the case represented a direct challenge to conventional interpretations of human memory. In Germany, the episode also gave rise to reflections that went beyond the field of psychology. Mannheim, a city destroyed by the war and rebuilt in the following decades, had become a symbol of rebirth. The memory of a British boy, born in a former enemy country, who seemed to evoke the life of a railway worker killed in 1944, took on a symbolic tone. It was as if, on a human level, history united the two sides of a once divided Europe, not by belief but by memory. In 2005, shortly before Stevenson's death, the Südwestrundfunk, SWR broadcaster, produced a documentary that revisited the case. The original recordings were shown to the public for the first time. The voice of a 10-year-old boy with a slight accent, pronouncing words in German that seemed to cross time. Mutter Greta, der Fluss ist nah. The tone was calm, almost contemplative. The final narration of the program reproduced a phrase from Stevenson. If these cases prove nothing, at least they remind us that the human mind is vaster than we imagine. Paul, rarely mentioned by his real name, remained away from interviews. He lives discreetly in southern England, and according to records, sent a letter to the University of Virginia in 2006, thanking them for the kindness with which a man treated a confused child who spoke of a past that was not his own. Today, the case EU47 Mann is studied more as a historical record of Stevenson's scientific method than as evidence of reincarnation. For researchers of mind and memory, it represents a legitimate question mark, a reminder that not everything that consciousness manifests fits into the known models of learning, imagination, or cultural heritage. Between the silent archives of Charlottesville and the reconstructed banks of the Neckar River, a story told with precision and sobriety remains. Not that of a miracle, but that of an observation, the attempt to understand something that perhaps belongs to the border zone between the psychological and the spiritual. In the German context, the narrative of Paul and Friedrich echoes as a metaphor for the country's own reconstruction, a memory that crosses ruins and resurfaces in a new form. Thus ends the account of the boy of many lives, not as proof but as an open question, recorded by a researcher who believed that the true role of science was to recognize the inexplicable, not to deny it. The truth, Ian Stevenson wrote in his last manuscript, may not be in proving the impossible, but in accepting what we do not yet know how to explain.